Hello, I'm Adinsur and welcome to my Holy Paladin guide for patch 7.2.5. Now, before I start this guide, there is something we have to get out of the way first. There seems to be a lot of misinformation going around about Holy Paladins, and I assume it's due to basically two things. We know that Blizz designed all classes in Legion to kind of represent their class fantasies. However, the fantasy they were going for when it comes to Holy was a two-hander wielding healer that can dish out some damage while healing and buffing allies. Problem is, they didn't make that playstyle viable at all, basically, up until very recently. So they were going for something specific but failed to give us the tools to play it the way it's meant to be played. Or they gave us the tools but they were just shit tools. Now, the second reason for all the misinformation is that there are simply too many semi-viable builds that suit a very different array of player. And what I mean by semi-viable is if you can't make one of the two best builds work, or simply don't like the playstyle of them, you can safely pick between a couple of other builds and still remain competitive. Now, most people aren't progressing through Mythic on a hardcore level, so the penalty of not playing the best build isn't that big. Therefore, this applies to the majority of the player base. Now, one more thing, I waited until the new raid got released so I could try it out and see if I needed to change anything, but turns out not so much. I'll tweak a few things here and there. With that said, let's start the guide off with the stat priority. Our best stat is intellect. Not much to say here. Now, the go-to secondary stat when choosing what gear to wear is crit, and lots of it. You can basically go all out on crit until you reach 50%. That's the cap without the 2-set bonus from Nighthold. With it, it's 45%, but that's soon not gonna be relevant as people are gonna start switching the set bonuses out. But then again, maybe not, since all of the Warforged and Titanforge gear and so on. Now, the reason for that cap is because it will make it so that your Holy Shock always crits, even when not in Avenging Wrath. Now, while Avenging Wrath is up, the cap is at 30%, but honestly, you should at least try to get 40% if you are below eye level 900, although that's rare these days. So after 40% of crit, Mastery and Versatility become much closer to crit, and I recommend taking an item level upgrade over a crit increase, again, if you are around item level 900. If you are above 905, it becomes really easy to get the 45% or 50% cap. Now, moving on, you will want to go versatility after crit, even though it's not far above mastery. And haste is the least useful, but not useless. The lowered global cooldown it gives us is actually really good, and it isn't far behind mastery and versatility at all. So as you can see, as a Holy Paladin, you shouldn't have much problems with gear, because all of the stats are useful to some extent, while crit being above all else. Now, if you're min-maxing, you should go for the crit cap as soon as you can, and try to get versatility in every piece of gear alongside that crit. And if you can't get versatility, then go for mastery. Also, one more thing, don't mind anyone that tells you PvP gear is shit in PvE. It has all of the stats we need. All PvP gear gives versatility, and if you get crit with it, you're golden until you get that awesome PvE gear. Now, speaking of golden, during the golden age of WoW, all the way back in Vanilla and TBC, Palis were actually very similar to today. They are now, as they were then, spot healers for the entire raid. However, due to some passives, they often got the job of spam healing the tanks. This only became more prevalent by the time Wrath came. Now during that time, Palis were only considered tank healers, and I see people saying this to this day for the reason that they were the best tank healers. But with that came the boring ass gameplay of just spamming Flash of Light and Holy Light on the tank. But moving on to Mop and Warlords, they were a mixed bag between a throughput healer and an absorption healer, like the Disc Priest at the time. Now, I'm guessing that the extra absorption effect of the mastery was really hard to balance. Actually, Holy Palis were quite OP in some patches. And now we come to Legion. So we've combined the best of both worlds. We are again spot healing, but with a shit ton of different spells, not just Flash of Light and Holy Light, and we excel at it. We also are the best tank healers. So we have the two roles we had in the past, and no one can perform those two roles in raids better than a Holy Pally. The main portion of this video will be discussing the various different builds of this spec. Let's start with the most fun build, in my opinion, the Shokadin build. To make it work, you need only 3 talents: Crusader's Might, Holy Avenger, and Sanctified Wrath. The rest of the talents are interchangeable for whatever situation you are in. As an example, this is a build focused around these talents. Now, it's mostly for Mythic Plus dungeons in which you are planning to do quite a bit of DPS in. And don't think that you can't do high Mythic Plus runs with this build, as you don't lose much in terms of healing cooldowns. You just have a choice whether you want to DPS with them, heal, or both. As an example, I did a plus 14 in the new Mythic dungeons, which are by all estimates much harder than the old ones, with this build, and I didn't have much trouble healing it. But back to the 3 talents themselves. By using them at the same time in combination with a DPS spot like Prolonged Power or Old War, you will absolutely destroy bosses when you burst. However, by doing this, it renders you almost useless for the next 2 minutes. So, as you might imagine, it's not very good in raids, but there is a time to use it in raid as well. Maybe not in hardcore progression, but you can find time to DPS in a lot of Nighthall boss fights, and now Tomb of Sargeras as well, which is usually at the start of the fight. And by the way, you can absolutely do good damage even without this build, so don't think it's a mandatory build for a Holy Paladin that wants to do some dips. It's just a mandatory build for a Shokadin. Now let's see the other dungeon build. This one you can also use to great effect if you are in raiding environment with around 10 people, which is rare these days, but in any case. Let's call it the easy mode build. It's focused around Beacon of Virtue. I used this talent to great effect early in Legion when I first tried it, and I included it in my Holy Pally guide back then. It basically works as a mini Aura Mastery sacrifice, but with a far shorter cooldown. And of course it's almost exclusively useful in groups of 5 to 10. There are some other uses and you will spot them as you raid, though I didn't find a massive increase in healing on any encounter to make it mandatory. So to get its full potential, you should take Sanctified Wrath with it, as you can squeeze in more Holy Shocks in a single bacon while having wings up, and wings also lasts longer, so you will have more bacons in those wings. Now, Bestow Faith is another talent that works well with it, because you can precast it and activate the bacon before Bestow expires. That way you save some global cooldowns. Now, one tip about the Beacon of Virtue: you can precast a procced Flash of Light while spamming the bacon, so you actually get the benefit of the Flash of Light heal, since they changed the spells and projectiles in Legion. That way you save even more extra global cooldowns in the duration of the bacon. Now, an example build would look like this for both dungeons and small raids. And one more thing, when it comes to Mythic Plus, you will be taking Devotion Aura 9 times out of 10, since the other two don't get much use in dungeon environments, and the passive damage reduction of Devotion doesn't decrease by a lot. Now we come to the hotly debated issue of what build is better. In my opinion, they are both great, and with the new tier 20 set bonuses, they both get benefits from it, so you can't go wrong with either one. The first one gets a bigger buff from those bonuses and might, just barely, might end up outshining the other one. And I used this build for most of Legion, even though it wasn't the best one. A reason is it worked for me, though for Tomb progression I switched mostly because I wanted to change things up. And let's call this one the WOD build. So the point is that you stay in the ranged camp for most of the time, while getting 100% of your mastery on the whole melee group and the ranged group. No other build allows this to happen, and it's focused around Bacon of the Lightbringer, as you might have guessed. The downside to it is that it only gives you one Bacon, so you only ever get to heal one tank, and in Nighthold and in Doom both tanks are getting damaged at the same time for most of the time, but less so in Doom, so keep that in mind. What it provides though is really good as well. As I said, you can sit in the ranged camp and you don't have to worry about your mastery. You can heal almost everyone with it, with the full potential of it, but the basic gist of this build is high amounts of healing all around, a choice of whether to Light of Dawn the melee or ranged group, or both, since you can position more easily than if you were in the melee camp all the time. Basically a continuation of the Warlord's playstyle, without the absorbs, which is still a playstyle a lot of Palis prefer. Really the only talent that must be paired with Lightbringer for this build to work is Divine Purpose. The rest of the talents aren't specific for this build. A commonly used one looks like this. Before we move on to the last build, there is something else that intrigued me with this new patch. The buff to Fervent Martyr. Now, don't get me wrong, the other two talents in this tier are far better, but there is something to be said for this talent, and that is it provides a unique gameplay experience. First of all, no matter what talents you pair it up with, you will get the most diverse gameplay of all of the builds. You will be using literally all of your abilities constantly, and all of them will be worth using. It also makes it so that you can use Light of the Martyr basically after every Flesh or Holy Light, and it will barely damage you and barely cost any mana, while giving your initial heal a 50% increase. Not to mention the combination with Avenging Wrath. I'm always scared to use Martyr a lot while I have wings up, but with this talent you won't have to worry. That's really on a side note. Anyway, let's talk about the build most people say is the best one at the moment, and the one which I started with in Tomb. For this one, let's look closely at each talent and why we take it. So, up until this patch, Bestow Faith was the go-to, as Light's Hammer was incredibly expensive for what it did. Thankfully now we have a choice. To be honest, both are good talents now, and it will mostly depend on what you like to use more, but also on what boss fight you are in. In the next tier, Rule of Law is the only choice. It's not because of the healing increase it gives from its mastery boost, as I thought it was. It's more for the range, since I found myself in raids often out of range of people, mostly when they needed it the most. So when they are soaking something, or for instance being thrown by Gul'dan's bonds, it's just a useful spell that also works great with Light of Dawn, as the base range of Light of Dawn is really low, something like 19 yards. As for the other two talents, you don't really need the extra charger, as one is enough when we have good instant heals to keep healing with while moving. And you don't usually need two Divine Shields in most boss encounters, so the choice is obvious. Now in the CC tier, really it's your pick between the Stun and the Blinding Light, and since Blinding Light doesn't do damage anymore, it is really more than ever your choice. Okay, here we are. The auras. My preferred one has always been Devotion Hour. simply because I was always of the mindset that absorbed or decreased damage is always better than the same damage being healed afterwards. Plus, if we pick it, it becomes our one and only real raid cooldown, of which we have none that are baseline. The thing is, in this raiding environment, we are the best throughput healers, and so we have to embrace that role. We have to sacrifice our raid cooldown for the HPS increase. And when I say we have to, I mean if you want to go for this specific build. Honestly, I feel like I'm just padding the meters with the other two options. For starters, sacrifice is just an odd talent. If you plan on using it, you need to waste every single cooldown, or almost every single cooldown, and even Valen's legendary if you have it, in conjunction with Aura Mastery to get use from it. It's incredible what you can do in those 10 seconds, yes. You can top off the entire raid multiple times, but after that you are just out of the game. You are basically tapping out and letting the other healers take care of things until you have cooldowns again. The thing with this aura is it's not really for any serious progression, however it's really fun to use. So I would recommend trying it out with Avenging Wrath, Holy Avenger, Tears Deliverance and so on for some amazing heals. But for this build you will be taking Mercy. It's a shitty aura in my opinion, but the HPS speaks for itself. Moving on, for this build there is no recommended spell out of the next three. All of them can be used on all encounters effectively, although I always lean towards Holy Avenger as it gives you a more robust rotation of cooldowns and you can never go wrong with mini Bloodlust. That also gives your main spell a healing increase. Moving on to the next tier, when judging by HPS alone, Judgment of Light is by far the best option. For this talent I would recommend using a macro that casts your judgment on your target's target if it's hostile, or another macro that uses it on the closest hostile mob. I'll have both in the description, so pick which one you prefer, but really you have to use one of these as the tab targeting is shit in Legion for some reason. Now finally we pick Beacon of Faith. It's just too good. I mentioned before that these days in almost all encounters both tanks take damage most of the time, so double Beacon is incredible and there is no topping it. Now, the way to play this build is the most straightforward, and it's basically cooldown management. You have 5 major cooldowns without including Lay on Hands and Rule of Law, so pairing them up and knowing when to use them is the main thing to keep in mind. Examples are pre-casting Tears Deliverance and instantly popping Holy Avenger, and that way you gain 2 or 3 extra global cooldowns in that Holy Avenger time frame. It's also not a big deal to use Light's Hammer anymore, so because of the buff, so to be honest you can use it preemptively. Wings and Rule of Law is a common pair up as well. Though Rule of Law doesn't actually boost your healing by a lot, that extra few percent make your wings that much powerful. Plus, Light of Dawn is with those two cooldowns paired up around 50% stronger and has a 50% increased range. Also, you don't want to be moving around and about trying to save low HP players with wings on, when you can just Rule of Law and heal them from where you are standing. Wings and Aura Mastery Mercy is a common pairing as well, because without the wings, Mercy doesn't heal nearly as much. So that's it for the builds. I'll talk about the gameplay of this one a little bit later. Now I'll have to mention the legendaries, as they are an integral part of the game, no matter how much I personally hate the system. Now I'll quickly go over the best ones. The best legendary is the Drape of Shame, as most Holy Palis know, and you can find it in Lower Karazhan from the Maiden. Now you can also get a much higher item level of it from Mythic Plus, so it will be the best cloak for the entire expansion probably. Besides that, there are 5 best legendaries that are interchangeable depending on the encounter and your healer and raid composition. But to be honest, if you have any 2 of these 5, you are set. And they are Soul of the High Lord. This one will be exceptionally good with the new 4 set, and of course it's really good now. Prida's Neck, which I really like, and it plays really well with our Aura of Sacrifice, Blessing of Sacrifice and Light of the Martyr. We get much more use from it than any other class that isn't a tank. The next one is Valen's Future Sight. The thing about this trinket, it has synergy with Aura of Sacrifice, since the aura only duplicates effective healing, not overhealing. So Valence actually gives you a 50% safety net if you accidentally overheal. The fourth one are Obsidian Stalled Shoulders, which won't be as viable, so they won't be in the top 5 once you get the 4 set from Doom, but for now they're awesome. And lastly we have Jewel of Silvermoon, which is especially good with the last build I showed you, as you will be using Judgment on cooldown anyway for the healing, and the 15% increase in healing done for 5 seconds every 10 seconds is actually really good. In an ideal world you would have 15% increased healing for 50% of all encounters. As for the artifact, it's a bit too late to be talking routes you take, but if you just got your new 4 traits, you should go for the shock treatment and deliver the light first, followed by the 2 Light of Dawn traits. Then it's basically up to you. As for the relics, it doesn't matter that much which ones you choose, as they don't change our healing output that much, but ideally you would go for the same 4 traits I mentioned before. So shock treatment, deliver the light, and if you don't have those, go for the 2 Light of Dawn ones. So besides those 4, you shouldn't be focusing on the traits as much as the item level of the relics. Now for consumables it's pretty straightforward. Intellect Flask, Potion of Prolonged Power for healing, or Mana Pot if you find yourself going out of mana. And if you decide to DPS at the start of the fight, pre-pot with Old War. As for food, the Suramar Feast is the best for us. It gives us 500 intellect, but at 2k gold per piece, and if your guild isn't making it, then you just buy the cheaper feast yourself, or make it. It's really easy to make with cooking. For engines and sockets, it's intellect in one socket and crit in the rest. Mark of the Ancient Priestess for the neck enchant, Binding of Intellect for the cloak, and Binding of Critical Strike for the rings. Now before we end things, let's go over the gameplay of the most relevant build at the moment one more time. So the main thing is keep Judgment and Holy Shock on cooldown, like all of the time. Use Light of Dawn when more than 4 people take damage, preferably paired with the first charge of Rule of Law, while keeping the second charge for emergencies or wings. For every global cooldown in downtime, that means when there is no healing to be done, use DPS abilities including Consecration. They all do massive amounts of DPS, for a healer I mean. In the case when you don't have a proc of Flash of Light, and both Light of Dawn and Holy Shock are on cooldown, go for Light of the Martyr, and that's the priority system. The rest is just cooldown management. Now, as a Holy Paladin, you don't even have to know the boss fights in and out to be able to rotate cooldowns well, as the other healers do. So if you get the priority system and the cooldown rotation down, you can have a cooldown for every single boss ability that requires one. Also, as a Paladin who doesn't have Devotion Aura, you don't really have any raid cooldowns, as Wings, Holy Avenger, Tears Deliverance and the rest are your personal cooldowns, and it really destroys any Paladin's healing potential and their potential to save lives when they are called out for as raid cooldowns. So whenever a raid leader asks you for them, the only thing you can do is switch to Devotion Aura, but other than that, don't be afraid to respond with I basically don't have any raid cooldowns. However, what you can do is put the other healers at ease and announce when you are using your personal cooldowns. Anyway, most of the time you should be in the melee group for basically a lot of reasons. You will easily hit 5 people with your Light of Dawn, and you will always be healing with Aura of Mercy, as well as be able to DPS in a heartbeat. But the most important thing if you want to play up Holy Pally good is one thing and one thing alone, and that's quick reflexes. You need to be quick with every single spellcast so that you are active 99% of the time, and you can check that on the logs, if you are doing logs. whenever anyone takes damage, you should be the first to respond with a Holy Shock first. You cannot be a good Holy Pally if you take your time even for a second. And one more thing that's not actually related to this build, if you are using Sacrifice Aura, be sure to let every healer know when you are using it, so that you don't overlap anything with it, as you don't need anything more than your own cooldowns during that time. If I were to sum up my thoughts about this spec at the moment, I would say that it's probably in the best spot it's ever been in. It's the top healer along with rest of shamans. It has a lot of viable builds. I went over 5 of them. I doubt there are any more, but I could be mistaken. It has a lot of spells, of which almost none are bad, and all of them have their uses. As always, things will probably change in the next few months with all of the gear and hotfixes, but if you're thinking of healing, going into Tomb of Sargeras, you can't go wrong with the Pally. That's all for now. For all of the macros, check the description, and see you next time.